Hello, everyone. Welcome to Informed Dissent, a news podcast that brings you dispatches from the gender culture war. I am Ben Appel. I am the author of Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic. It's out this November 4th. It's now available for pre-order. I'm here with my co-host, author, and needle felter, Lisa Sellen Davis, who's also writing a book about this on this topic. Gender Clinic whistleblower and co-executive director of LGBT Courage Coalition, Jamie Reed. The disenchanted transsexual Corey Cohn, who's celebrating a birthday today. Corey identifies as 50 today. And so happy birthday. Cheers all around. And the always insightful writer and researcher Sarah Mittermeier, who is also writing a book about this topic. So we're very anticipating Lisa's and Sarah's books as well. Today we have a very special guest. We're doing something new and exciting and different. Dr. Anna Hutchinson is here with us. We're very honored to have you here. Dr. Hutchinson is a London-based clinical psychologist with 25 years of experience specializing in adolescent mental and physical health. From 2013 to 2017, she worked at the Tavistock Clinic's Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, where she observed firsthand the significant shifts in patient demographics and referral rates. She raised concerns about the weak evidence base and clinical practices, contributing key insights to Hannah Barnes's book, Time to Think. Since leaving GIDS, Anna has continued to advocate for nuanced care for gender-distressed youth. She co-led the clinical induction training for Hilary Cass's new Gender Hubs and is currently co-authoring a book with family therapist Anastasis Spiliadis on developmentally informed therapy for gender-related distress in children. Very exciting. Welcome, Dr. Hutchinson. We're excited to have you here. We're going to get to chatting with you in a few minutes. Before I just want to get through some of these headlines really quickly. There's a lot that happened this week. First, the big news, which broke yesterday, the LA Children's Hospital Pediatric Gender Clinic is closing on July 27th. This is Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy's clinic, where she's the medical director. Yesterday morning, staff received an email from one of the executives there, I think the CEO, announcing that due to threats from the federal government of prosecution of providers and threats to funding and eligibility for Medicare, Medi-Cal, they have to close. So they're dealing with that fallout. It's a big news story. We'll talk about that. Couple more. The New Hampshire Senate has passed restrictions on transgender healthcare for minors. So New Hampshire Governor Kelly Ayotte signed both of these bills into law, actually. One outlaws blockers and hormones for under 18s, and one prohibits gender-affirming chest surgeries before 18. And there was also, the governor also signed a bill this week that establishes a parental bill of rights, which gives parents more oversight into their children's public school education. A new Gallup poll shows that 2/3 of Americans prefer birth sex on IDs and for athletics to be organized by birth sex. 9 out of 10 Republicans and 4 out of 10 Democrats. I'm really curious about who those 1 out of 10 Republicans are, actually, now that I come to think of it. 6 out of 10 Democrats, I have an idea of who they are, but the 1 out of 10 Republicans, it's intriguing. Minnesota is now facing a Department of Justice probe after a trans athlete led a high school girls softball team to a state title. This softball story, a lot of us were following it, but a lot of more people heard about it because it sparked a back and forth between the Olympic champions Simone Biles and the elite swimmer Riley Gaines, who advocates for women and girls sports. So that kind of all unfolded on X. Simone did apologize for her comments. There's still a lot of miscommunication, but it'll be interesting to see, I think, how that unfolds and how that evolves, because I think there was a door open there. I don't know. It's just going to be interesting to see what Simone does in the future. And because everybody immediately turned on her the second she apologized to Riley.
That's such a difference from it used to be the minute you said, like, well, yeah, men and women are slightly different, and then the next day you'd have to apologize, right, for saying something obvious. And this was probably the first time I've seen a celebrity forced to apologize for saying the wrong thing on the other side.
Right.
Well,
And
I
then
guess it's something. I
yeah,
don't know what it is.
absolutely. But the biggest news, really quickly before we continue, Zoe Saldana. She won the Best Supporting Actress Academy Award this year for her role in Emilia Perez.
Great movie.
She has announced that her Oscar is trans and goes by they them pronouns. So that's congratulations to Zoe and to her Oscar for coming out.
Oh
All
no,
right.
you're misbehave.
So people had a whole article about that. News breaking.
Wait, is that a real thing?
Yes.
Yeah, she really did say
I thought Benny made it up.
No, I did not make that up.
She
People
really
Magazine had
does.
an entire article.
Oh, I thought it was your stand-up
No,
comedy.
no, I'm not that funny. Um, all right.
Can
Dr.
we
Hutch,
add
actually,
one more? Can we add one
yes,
Twitter update from the week?
100%. What?
The pissed off lawyer
Oh.
has
Yes.
announced her detransition.
Hendrix.
Hendrix.
Okay, but this is very niche. Can you give?
This is very, very online.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. This is very niche.
Yeah,
there's
people
a-
don't.
There's a Twitter account called The Pissed Off Lawyer. This has been an account for a very long time who's been very much, in the TRA camp. And we've started to see some tweets maybe over the past month of her just being more open to conversation. And apparently there's been a lot of TERFs who have been liking some of her posts. And then she announced her detransition this week. And then JK asked her to unblock her. And they had some DMs exchanged. And then promptly, Hendrix has been removed from her board position at a LGBTQIA organization where she had been doing legal volunteer work for, I believe, 29 years.
Well, that's terrible.
It is
Yeah.
terrible.
How old is that person, Jamie?
How old?
Hmm.
Not my age.
Looks exact.
And oh, you think that old, Corey?
I think Hendrix is like my age.
Early 40s, maybe late 30s, early 40s.
Oh,
That was my guess. But
late 30s. Oh. No,
I'm
I
a grandma here.
yeah,
Well,
it'll be interesting to see what happens there. What are your thoughts, Lisa?
I just interesting to see if more people try to find their way back, and then how you do, or you mean you can't go back, right? So find their way, follow. I mean, in Corey's footsteps of leaving one place and figuring out where you're going or being where you are.
Yeah, only forward.
It's interesting to see the arc there because this happened kind of quickly, like right before our eyes. Suddenly, it was like 2 weeks ago that I started seeing interactions between this person, the pissed off lawyer, who would show up on my X feed a lot, and different, gender critical people, and saying how, crazy trans activists were behaving and so on. And it was so different, like a literally 180 from what I had seen previously and very, very recently. So that was kind of fascinating to watch. I know there's like a lot of reaction. There's obviously J.K. Rowling saying like, welcome, let's chat. There's other people. Jamie, you had a kind message and others did as well. There was a lot of mean messages from trans activists. And then there were some people who were really skeptical about it. I noticed saying that this person can't be trusted, or they're, doing this, I don't know, to gain kind of some access to and get closer to people, whatever. I mean, I guess those are all maybe legitimate concerns because things are so crazy.
It's so bad though that this person is, let's say, exploring their gender identity, and then they get expelled from the board that they've worked in for decades.
Yeah.
Something's happening in the mirror right now. From these headlines you've shared.
Absolutely. And is it clear? Did Hendricks say that she lost her job because of
Not a
that?
job.
volunteer position.
Volunteer
So
position.
she's
Okay.
an attorney, I believe, who owns her own firm,
Got it.
but volunteering.
Okay. So her belonging.
And what would it, I mean, could you imagine what if this LGBTQIA org embraced her and said, hey, you run the legal transition clinic for names. Now we can just add that you can also help detransitioners who are seeking. I mean, what messaging that could have been to the wider community there.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still gay.
That
Yeah.
would have been awful for
You're
us.
one of us.
It really mirrors. I mean, I've got, first-hand accounts of colleagues who have been working, post-CAS in a post-CAS way in the UK, who are not at all actually gender critical and certainly wouldn't identify that way, but just by working in line with CAS have been rejected from their LGBT groups or organizations. So this is it, in this area, there's so much cancelling from, all different areas. And it just shows how much we can't tolerate. We can't tolerate stuff.
Let's use that as a segue.
Yes,
Let's
absolutely. And so, yeah, I'm gonna hand the reins over to Jamie because Jamie does have some questions ready for Dr. Hutchinson, which I'm excited to hear the answers to. Actually, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But actually, I do have one question from the bio that I was reading of yours. It says you co-led the clinical induction training for Hillary Cass's new gender hubs. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so as part of her concluding report of the review that Hillary Cass conducted, she recommended the closure of the one gender service we had in the UK, which was GIDS, and to replace it, she recommended a number of hubs spread across the country with a new approach, really, which was very much like holistic, ensuring that every staff member worked in more than gender. So we didn't end up with just gender therapists. We had broad pediatric CAMS type clinicians all working together in a new way. And obviously, because we've had the PDT blocker ban in the UK at the moment, at point of entry to the service, what has to be offered is holistic assessment and really broad interventions. And I'm hearing positive news, so young people who are not going to school are being helped back to school, that are getting broader diagnostic assessments, which might be helpful in some cases. So, yeah.
That's great. And then where is the gender hubs opening process? Like, are there, how many
So I
have
think we've
opened?
got 3, I think. I'm no longer involved. I did my bit and moved on. I think we've got 3 open with 3 planned, but somewhere in that process.
And this is across the UK or England? Just England?
Across
England,
UK. Yeah.
England.
In
Okay.
England at the moment. There are different, people are managing things differently in Wales and Ireland, Scotland. Yeah.
Got it.
And is anyone keeping track of how these kids who only have access to therapy are doing versus the GIDS cohorts?
They are being well assessed, and there is data being collected because, of course, that was a massive problem with the GIDS. One of the most objective criticisms was there was no data, so I think they are having to collect very high quality data about all those young people, but they've been open, less than a year, so it's going to take a long time to get that data in any sort of meaningful, helpful way. But yeah, I don't see any way that they can not follow up the young people now and keep their data safe.
It's interesting to think about what's similar to our situation in America and what's different in that, we're having government funded centers like Children's Hospital Los Angeles shut down, which I will talk more about, and bans on puberty blockers in certain states. And it was government led in England too. But obviously we have our very different situation state by state here, but no one, Cass did not recommend just shutting down. She recommended replacing and reinventing, and I don't I haven't heard.
Yeah, and
Have you
I
guys?
mean, she had to though. We had, I think at the moment even we've got 6,000 plus young people on the waiting list for these services. The demand is there, and we know these are really vulnerable young people, and in the UK, I don't think we could even conceive of just shutting that service. And where would they go? There had to be an attempt to fill the gap, but with 6,000 on the waiting list, not all of them will ever reach that service, sadly.
So Anna,
Jamie.
I'm so glad that you are here today. I wanted us to do one more episode on the New York Times podcast called The Protocol. And I think we are probably at episode 5 and 6 now, which is why we wanted to invite you. I have 6 questions. The first one is really easy and simple. Anna, have you listened to any of the podcast, The Protocol? Did you listen to episode 5? And have you ever spoken to a zine? Did you have any thoughts that you might have been in this podcast?
Yes, so I've listened to your episode, The Whistleblower, and the 2 that followed, which was the review and what was it called, Now or Future or something?
Now.
So I've listened to those 3, yeah. I mean, I've met with Azine. She interviewed me for a New York Times article last year. And yeah, I met her at various conferences and events, so I have spoken to Azine, yeah. And that's on record.
So episode 5 is called The Review.
Yeah.
But the podcast timeline is really fragmented to me. So it starts with FG, then it goes to the transitioner who only Sarah can pronounce correctly because she speaks French, I think. Enough. Okay. Then we have the whistleblower. Is that the right order? Who am I missing? No, then we have Laura Edwards Leeper. Then we have the whistleblower, and then we have the review. So do you think it helps, harms? Does it make any sense? And this is a question pretty much for everybody, that the whistleblower comes before the review when we know in the timeline that what happened in the UK was that there were 10 whistleblowers well before any whistleblowers ever show up in the United States. So timeline-wise, I felt that it was fragmented and does not put the whistleblower from the US within this larger sense that there's this national whistleblower kind of situation. So can you maybe talk about that timeline and
So I mean, yeah. So you'll say, I mean, it did sound like you were the only person who'd ever voiced concerns about the youth gender clinics, and that must have felt a bit unfair, actually. So in the UK, it wasn't just 10, so the story is that, as the numbers went up and the demographics were changing, and as the Finnish data shows, young people are getting more complex in their presentations, those of us working in GIDS started sharing our concerns with each other. And after lots of attempts, that culminated in 10 of us going to one of the senior clinicians, Dr. Dave Bell, who was on the Board of Governors. He was the staff representative, so entirely appropriate. Now, Dr. Bell was quite animated by what he heard from these 10 people and wrote a report. So in a sense, he became a whistleblower as well. So then you've got 11. And then that report went to the Board of Governors at Tavistock, and one very prominent senior clinician there, Marcus Evans, he then went to the press, as did his wife, who'd previously worked in GIDS way back before we had. That's Susan Evans. So now you've got 13 whistleblowers. And some of the people on the Board of Governors spoke to Hannah Barnes, for example, as well. So there was not one person who had to carry it all in the UK in that regard. And then, people came and they spoke out, and there's been a lot of people speaking in the UK and expressing concerns in a professional capacity. Yeah, and some of the people speaking now are not those original 10 as well. So it's been a real process, and that's been over 10 years over here.
In the framing of the New York Times podcast. Can you talk at all about the political landscape of those whistleblowers out of Tavistock or GIDS
At the time,
at the time?
way back.
Okay, let's rephrase it. Are you a mean Republican?
I don't think I can vote for the Republican Party for a start. Am I a mean Republican? No, we were all incredibly left-wing. We all, like, you could judge us whatever way you want politically, but very left-wing, very progressive group of people who worked together, got on very well because we were under intense pressure. Lots of different gender identities, sexualities, a very liberal group of North London professionals in the Tavistock. So none of us came, as far as I'm aware, from even a right-wing background. And a lot of those people you talked about, Dave Bell's always been a proud member of the Labour Party, no, we're not. People have their own political beliefs, and that's absolutely fine too. And I wouldn't be critical of people being right-wing, but as a group, we were not what we have maybe been characterised as being. And certainly, it was implied even by the institution that we were transphobic, which I always found, well, number one, obviously hard to take on a personal level. But secondly, well, why have you employed 10 transphobic clinicians? And what are the odds that you'd let 10 transphobes get into your clinic in the first place? So yeah, we were, as you saw, anybody who speaks out people will try, when it makes people uncomfortable, they will try and find ways to silence that voice. But I didn't identify, and still don't in some ways, as a whistleblower. We've talked about this before, Jamie, in that I just followed the routes that my professional guidelines say I have to follow if I think children are at risk. So even being called a whistleblower kind of others me from actually what was just a professional duty, like, essentially.
That's a really good point. Thank you for that. Do you feel like, let me just review what the podcast says about kind of the 10 providers who come forward. So the podcast says that there's 10 providers who come forward with a whistleblower report. The outcome of that report was that GIDS wasn't fit for service, but that an internal review was conducted, and that internal review found that everything was fine.
Yeah.
The whistleblower report was then leaked to the media in the UK, and it is because of that that Cass is appointed. Do you kind of feel like that characterization of that timeline lines up? And then I have one tiny little follow-up question. I remember a news story when I still worked in the Gender Center in the US that there were 4 clinicians at Tavistock or GIDS that quit at the same time.
I think there was more. I think there was, was it Sky? Somebody was reporting in about 2018, 2019 that I think upwards of 20 had quit in a very short amount of time. And they definitely had massive turnover of staff at that point when it was all getting very hot. We don't know why people were quitting. And, again, it could be because people felt that the environment was too toxic, but equally it could be that other people were concerned about the practice within the clinic at the time. So I think that timeline is broadly right. What I would add is that because of the public disquiet about what may or may not be going on in the clinic, the CQC was asked, so they're a governance body, a health body that the NHS uses to ensure that clinical practices meeting best standards. The CQC went into the Tavistock GIDS clinic and found their staff to be kind and good people, but everything else was really rated as inadequate. So there was objective data there. And Dr. Cass didn't just start the Cass review. She actually, first of all, was asked to review the existing evidence base for the medical interventions by the National Institute of Clinical and Health Excellence, which is another NHS aspect. It's another organisation that works with the NHS to make sure that the treatment that is offered on the NHS is as well evidence-based and financially appropriate as it can be. So she sort of supported that review of the evidence back in 2020, and this group concluded that there was no evidence, there was not enough evidence either way for the medical treatment. So you've got, society, there's lots happening in the media. big feelings everywhere, clinicians leaving, this report is leaked, then the CQC find the service or report the service is inadequate, and then you get 2 evidence reviews that conclude there's not enough evidence. And that's when NHS England sort of had to do something. And that's when they commissioned Dr. Cass to do a full independent review looking at everything that was going on. So it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more to it.
So episode 5 goes on to have Marcy Bowers on, which I would love maybe if everybody wants to jump in on the Marcy Bowers section. But I feel like what Azine and Austin kind of frame up is that Cass and Marcy kind of both are recognizing this maybe push-pull, is there good evidence? And maybe they're both kind of saying, yeah, there's not very good evidence. Cass is saying there's not good systematic evidence. Marcy says, yeah, maybe there's not good evidence, but it's because mean Johns Hopkins buries, 30 years of clinical research, or doesn't bury it, but refuses to let Johns Hopkins continue. So what it kind of comes down to then is this concept around clinician self-reporting. The clinicians, and Marcy talks about seeing the
light come back.
The light come back in their patients' eyes. I would kind of like everybody to weigh in a little bit. Is Marcy conceding that there's no good evidence? If there's no good evidence, does that mean we just move to what all these clinicians are saying? And as a clinician yourself, Anna, I feel like Cass was saying some clinicians saw positives, but a lot of clinicians saw negatives.
And she stands by that. She's still in the media quite a lot talking about her review as different, things occur. She's often invited back on. She was on an interview today on Times Radio that I listened to. And she's still saying that. So people say, look, there's professional consensus that this is helping young people. And she always says, yes, I've heard clinicians report that this is life-saving and it really is helping people, but I've also heard the opposite, people that are concerned. But Marcy,
go ahead, Anna.
Did Marcy Bowers acknowledge that other professionals had different opinions or, understood it in a different way? No.
I thought what Marcy was saying was, Johns Hopkins clinic shut down in 79 or something like that because there was a Paul McHugh. Did he go to St. Louis then? That's not the guy you worked with, is it?
It's not, but what's so interesting that Marcy, I think Marcy put up a smoke screen. But
maybe, but what she was saying was they stopped collecting because they shut the research down. They stopped collecting data, and that the research was politicized. I don't know if that's true or not, and therefore we don't have good data because we haven't been collecting data for the last 30 years. And the thing is that nobody said, let's keep collecting great data. And then we had the data, what little data we had, for instance, Olson Kennedy's, was so strangely manipulated, or these other studies that said, well, the kids didn't get worse, so they got better, or the kids got better when you don't count the 2 suicides out of 315. And so we did have some evidence that you could argue showed improvement, but not when the methodology was scrutinized, or not when you accounted for people killed themselves after being affirmed and transitioned. And that, I think, is the nuance that would that's what makes this, especially in America where we don't have anything really like NICE. We have one government agency that's barely funded, and so we just don't have, there's nothing nonpartisan. So there's no way to explain to people, sure, you can find a study that says this makes kids better, but if you're looking at the quality of the study, then you won't be able to rely on it. And we've also been seeing the co-optation of systematic evidence review. We saw it from the state of Utah using that term. We see it in this page from Cornell, which insists it's a systematic review when it's a narrative kind of overview. So there are no words that aren't politicized, which just makes it very, very hard to clear away the muck here. And I get what Marcy Bowers was arguing, but we have $10 million of American taxpayer money went to a study on puberty blockers, and it showed nothing. It showed no change. So
which is what
do
we
we need
found
more?
Which is what we found in the UK as well. It was very similar to the early intervention study at GIDS, which it showed nothing. But what the conclusion was that I think the conclusion both papers came to was that often mental health goes down over adolescence, and these guys persisted and were in their lane. So maybe the theory is the puberty blockers were avoiding an inevitable decline, but that is a big jump. And there's no evidence.
It's a big jump when you have there's no comparison group, so you're just making.
And in the UK, they actually went back. They looked at a second group, analysed that data that came out of the GIDS intervention study, and they analysed it patient by patient, so looking at change within the patient rather than in the group. And they found that a third of the kids, approximately a third, did seem to improve on mental health measures, the questionnaires. Approximately a third had no change, but a third also got worse. So, we're looking at group means, but then you have the devil's in the detail, really. Yeah.
But it's also not going... Sorry.
No, you go.
I was going to say they're also, they're talking about, okay, we've forestalled or we've avoided this decline that would come with adolescence. They're also not going through adolescence. Like, that seems like a catch.
Maybe I misinterpreted this, but you were asking about like Marcy and the argument there, and Lisa was pointing out the difference between here and the UK and how politicized it is. And maybe my interpretation is a little bit off, but when I was listening to that episode, I kind of focused in on Marcy saying how Hillary Cass isn't a trans person and doesn't have any clinical experience treating trans people, right? So like, what does this woman know? I think at one point she said like a haughty old, like, I mean, just kind of criticized and ridiculed. And Marcy brings up a lot of the anecdotal evidence of, people's lights are coming on in their eyes, and she doesn't see, and we addressed this on the last pod, and Jamie had some really helpful things to say about this. But when I interviewed Laura, one of my interviews with Laura Edwards Leeper a couple years ago, she had pointed out, and something that we kind of all know, which is that something that really shifted in the US was that people with lived experience were being hired in gender clinics, and it wasn't people with, medical backgrounds. I wonder if that's a difference between things that happened in the UK and the US, because here, it so quickly went into gender affirming care, but so many people kind of brought this activist approach to, and this very like personal, I struggle, I'm projecting outward and kind of, I want to save all these people from, I don't know, dealing with whatever suffering or pain I've gone through, kind of a savior complex. But it was Dr. Edwards Leeper was saying how even doctors are deferring to these people who do not have clinical experience, but they're afraid of being accused of transphobia if they don't. So people are ignoring their, it's interesting you said that you're having like a kind of a developmental approach or adolescent, which Laura would point out in hers, like, is everybody forgetting their training in adolescent development, and how so that was completely sacrificed in the US, and I wonder if that is a difference there.
I don't think it's hugely different. I mean, we are, and you've got to see the merit in it, you know. So medicine used to be very sort of old school, patriarchal, top down, and perhaps didn't listen to the patients enough. And I think there's been a correction, and some might say an overcorrection, in some areas where we are really trying to engage with patient voices and people with lived experiences, whatever it is we're working with. But I think it's different with this field, isn't it? Because it's not just a medical, and some would argue it isn't a medical issue at all. It's so political, it's so personal, it's so deep in some people's lives that it sometimes makes it very difficult, I think, for people to have frank conversations. Because, you know, if you're talking with somebody who maybe came into the field because that's part of their identity experience, and they've come in with really good intentions and they're really passionate, and you're having to say, you know, but there's no evidence. That's a really difficult interpersonal conversation to have between two humans who might really like each other, who might really respect each other. So we're seeing it. Yeah, we are seeing it in the field.
So because then you're invalidating their experience. You're like,
right.
oh, I hear you.
Who would want to do that? Who would want to do that? Especially in small teams who've worked together for years, you know, who've like been trauma bonded because of the lack of resources, you know, and where you care about each other. So it does make connecting objectively to our training, to like evidence-based medicine in the field, really tricky, because you're also having to caretake each other. And I mean, that's what stood out for me in that podcast, was the big emotions. And of course, there should be big emotions in this field, but it's really hard, isn't it, to then get to an objective conversation when the emotion is so in the room.
Ben, I thought that was really interesting, that concept around the lived experience. I had not thought about it in terms of the podcast, but what you just brought up is something that they did not address in the podcast either, is that Joanna Olson Kennedy's spouse is trans identified. And I also see that Laura Edwards Leeper to Joanna shift, in that Joanna's in this field, or Johanna is in this field in part, I think, because of that lived experience. Most of the people that I worked with were either, I mean, we were hired in part. I was hired because I had a trans identified spouse. We had clinicians who had trans identified children, and that was part of why we were hired. And we went to a conference once in the community and we were chastised because we did not have more trans identified clinicians running our center. That was the complaint from the community. Corey, your thoughts on Marcy or the haughty old Cass? Whatever Marcy called her.
Well, maybe some thoughts to for us to process that might be challenging for us, right? So when we look at these groups on net, there don't seem to be improvements, but some of these clinicians really are convinced, really have convinced themselves that they see improvements.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, Hilary Cass believes that there are some members of this population that benefit. So if we are able to discover that a third of this clinical population seems to be improving, why not set up a funnel and cease the procedures for 2/3 that are not improving, and then continuing on the third that seem to be improving? So why not do that?
I think that's what Hilary Cass is recommending, actually. So this is her approach. She's saying, I have seen young people who've benefited from this medical intervention with my own eyes. But at the moment, there's not enough data to work out who will and who won't benefit. So we need to do a study. And that's why in the UK, the next step is to try and organise a study on puberty blockers. But where I get stuck, because I've worked with these kids for a long time, and I have also seen very happy young trans people, trans identified people, delighted with medical interventions and thriving and living in the world, right? And that's good to see. But seeing that itself is, I don't think you can conclude it's because of the medical intervention. You know, so as a psychotherapist, we often see things there's like, so across therapy, long-term therapy, sometimes you see something that we call a flight to health, where somebody's working with a really painful experience. And then suddenly something happens. They get a new job, a new partner, new haircut, and they're like, oh no, it's all good now. It's all good. And you see this massive improvement in their functioning. And and it's great, and you're like, this is fantastic. But what we can understand that as is actually a flight away from pain, like a reinstating or a reconnecting to old defenses or defensive ways of being in the world. So for me, when I see benefit, I think, well, number one, how are they benefiting? How do we measure that? Is it okay to just ask about mental health? That's my first question. What do we mean by benefit? But secondly, short-term benefit itself doesn't tell us much, because it often happens in therapy. And what does it mean long term? And then you've got the third aspect, which is, and at what cost? At what cost? And again, short term, the cost is going to be probably, very little. But what does that mean across a lifetime? So I absolutely agree, you can say some people benefit from this, but it depends on where you sort of put the frame and what you mean by benefit. But Cass agrees with you, Corey, that we should be better at identifying those who will benefit. So that's where the UK is going next.
That was the biggest dissonance for me in Dr. Cass's testimony in the review and so forth, and even in this podcast, where, like you said, there are clearly some young people that are benefiting, that are thriving. Now, we don't know if it's because of the medical interventions, but they have received these medical interventions and they're doing well. Then, in another breath, there's no longitudinal studies. We know that people choose to detransition or realize they've made some kind of error or mistake. They regret their decisions maybe 7 to 10 years down the road. So doesn't that kind of cancel out the, if and then we're talking about the possibility of doing a puberty blocker study. So it's like, well, all of these people might regret it, but in the now, they might be doing okay. And so, and we have to kind of trust that they're of a mature mind to be able to make decisions like this. I don't know. There's such a strong contradiction there, and I have trouble resolving that.
Also, what did every single young person do before 1990? And then, I mean, it wasn't offered in any, there were, probably a dozen people in America, doing this in like 2000. I mean, I found one case of a 13-year-old going on puberty blockers in 2001. I'm sure there were others, but it's just a handful of people. Wouldn't we have records of a whole bunch of non-functional people? If this is life-saving, wouldn't there be bodies from all of human history before this protocol?
Well, I think the answer, Lisa, is that because they weren't able to become their true selves, their souls died, but their bodies continued on, and unfortunately, as cisgender people.
Cisgender gay people.
Yeah, well, that's what's implied, that they would have suffered their whole life, But again, as a psychologist, what we see is people change. They change across their whole lives and they develop. And, my experience of humans is that they're actually incredibly resilient, So maybe they would have suffered desperately in adolescence, and that's awful. We'd all want to avoid that. But I think most people who suffer we all suffer, actually. Find a way to live with that, And so it's this kind of crystal ball question, isn't it? Like once you've intervened, you've altered a trajectory entirely. So it's very tricky ethically and also conceptually to understand what we're talking about, because once you've altered people's bodies and their life trajectories, it isn't like, I don't know, I'm not being coherent, but we're changing.
No, there's no sliding door. There's no, you can see, you go into the alternate universe and find out what would have been. But that's why I bring up human beings, soul, tortured souls aside. But I think the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the messaging that changed around this. And we hear from so many kids that they were told by the clinicians that they are at risk of suicide. And this is not, kids, you don't even have to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. This is the minute you claim this identity, you become vulnerable. And how much do you think, Anna, that telling kids that makes it true, that telling them that they're in danger, telling them that they've been harmed by people misgendering them or dead naming them, how much does that manifest into truly feeling harmed? And are you harmed because you feel harmed? And if you don't feel harmed, are you not harmed? This is a big thing I'm investigating right now. So I'm cheating a little bit, and you're here and I'm putting you on the spot, but this is all I've been thinking about for the past week. So
Okay.
Is that you can create distress.
Is that you can, but yes, and but also, have you harmed someone? If they don't feel harmed, are they harmed? If they do feel harmed, but nothing, do they feel harmed because somebody used a pronoun they don't like? So have they been harmed? If you medicalize them and they're happy and they don't feel harmed, but you feel you harmed them, have they been harmed? I mean, this is, I know this is a huge thing, but
Lisa, this is one of your huge questions that's got 2 or 3 PhDs behind it. Firstly, the kids are so different that, like, I want to express that the young people I work with are so different, and some of them have got lifelong gender dysphoria, and some of them have had it 3 weeks. So answering a question you can't answer simply about this group of young people. Having said that, what do we know? We know that you don't have to be psychologically trained to know that if you tell a kid something, they tend to believe you. And that's because they're young and they're dependent on the adults. So we all know if we tell a kid they're stupid or lazy, they will develop beliefs about that, and vice versa, right? It's the core of all of our obsession with parenting at the moment. What we tell kids changes kids. And there's definitely young people I'm working with who are absolutely terrified of puberty, because there is this narrative, whether they've been told it directly or whether it's just in society, that for some young people, puberty can essentially kill you. It's so distressing, and some young people have believed that. And do we create that? Do they create it? I don't know. It's all so much more complicated than that. But certainly, I think, again, going back to this concept of human resilience, for any kid, afraid or suffering, you'd want to help them cope with that, and maybe give them alternative ideas for how they might be able to bear things at the moment that they think are unbearable. And adolescence is, I don't know whether it's the same in the States, but in the UK, like, there's a general, like, kind of anti-adolescence or anti-puberty thing, I think, in the schools, where it's, all the bad things are talked about, like being, getting spots, and I don't know, your body changing, and you're going to be really moody. I work in a school sometimes, and I hear the stories, and it's such a shame, because adolescence can sometimes be joyful. We don't hear that. You get these amazing, the first experiences of things, and the first time you go out on your own and have a sleep. I've just been talking to a young person that I work with who's just had their first sleepover, and they stayed up all night, and it was amazing. So the story we're giving these kids is so bleak. And it makes them feel so vulnerable in the face of this thing that's going to happen to them, and they have no control over. So do we create that distress? Possibly we contribute to it. For some kids, I think it is self-generated for whatever reason. But for others, it just seems to be a narrative in the zeitgeist, which is probably not helping. Did that answer your question, Lisa? Or
yeah, that was a good start for the 3 PhDs that will follow.
We'll get some people to do those.
I have a question for you,
go
Anna. The big turning point for me, I think, like, part of my peaking was the April 2019 Times UK piece. It feels like conversion therapy for gay children, say clinicians. That was the title of the article. The subhead was ex-NHS staff fear that homophobia is driving a surge in transgender young people. And this details maybe like 5 different clinicians that Lucy Bannerman had interviewed, and they're not named. Are you one of them in this?
Yeah, no, I was one of those people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit talk a little bit about that?
So that was part of the journey of getting the information out there. And when we were first worried, and talking to each other in our clinic rooms, the environment, there was no concern being raised anywhere. And I think nobody knew what was actually happening in gender services, and perhaps didn't realize the massive change, in numbers that were coming forward, the sex ratio change with all these girls suddenly presenting, and as I said earlier, the more complex presentations that we were seeing. So we were trying to find a way to share that information, because the sense was if anybody put their head over the parapet at that time, they would just be cancelled and silenced, as we saw across society at that point. It was a very, very unsafe time to talk about concerns. So the 5 of us who went, again, a different group, so you can add up how many people have been involved over the years, had to be anonymous at that time, because I genuinely believe that had we said that and named ourselves at that point, we would have possibly lost our ability to practice, because I think they'd have gone straight away for our professional, qualifications and things. But so the homophobia that we were talking about there, there was, I think it's really fascinating. This is one of the other puzzling things, I think, for everyone in the field and in society. So you go back to that original Dutch study. I know you do this, Jamie, sometimes when you talk about it. And only one of the original 70 kids who were first offered affirmative medical interventions was exclusively opposite sex attracted. 1 out of 70. Now, what are the odds? What are the odds, Clearly sexuality is massively relevant, right? But we don't know how. And I know that some trans people would argue, well, actually, they're just straight, they're in the wrong bodies, right? That's the narrative. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're not. Or maybe there's something else more complicated going on here about same-sex attraction. And in those 2 original studies, De Vries, 2011 and 2014, they don't even comment on it. Like at the moment, we're all into like diversity and intersectionality. That's a massive intersectionality thing that we should be exploring. And it's just described, just like, oh yeah, that, that. So sexuality is there in the field and has been even for the young people, the adolescents, obviously. And yeah, we did see, quite explicit homophobia sometimes in the Tavistock. And naive homophobia often. So I can remember, working with a family where a very sweet, lovely dad, these are not abusive, horrific parents, a lovely dad, sort of literally trying to weigh up what would be worse for his child, a gay outcome or a trans outcome. So it was kind of there all the time. But we were a gender service, and we were just, Hilary Cass talks about diagnostic overshadowing. It wasn't just diagnostic, it was just overshadowing. So everybody was looking at gender, and it was like we'd forgotten what we knew about same-sex attraction, homosexuality, that was also in that group of kids and in all the data that's ever existed on these young people. And so we just didn't talk about it. It was taboo, but not taboo in an explicit you'd be shot down type way. It just wasn't allowed, in a sense. Sort of, we all subconsciously agreed not to talk about it. But then some of the gay clinicians did start trying to raise it, and it was a very, and this is way back, and many things happened after I left that I do not know what happened. But when I was there back in sort of 2015, 2016, gay clinicians were trying to raise it, and it was a very, very painful and difficult conversation, for people. Yeah. Does that answer your question,
Yeah,
Ben?
it was really helpful, because the way I think about it a lot is that, we have, for a lot of gay and lesbian people coming up, who weren't introduced to this idea that they were born in the wrong body, that kind of preceded this. um, grow up gay, but there's always this pressure of like not being too gay, you know, not being too butch, not being too femme. So there is a kind of
Too
mold
non-conforming.
that gay and yes, there's a kind of mold that gay and lesbian people have to kind of fit in.
Mm,
And I've talked about this a lot. We all talk about this is that I thought as this kind of gay liberation movement that we were headed towards a place where we were making more space for gender nonconformity so that there wasn't so much ridicule of people that were too gay or too butch and so on and so forth.
mm.
And then so I think what really complicated that is this idea of transitioning kids because gender precedes sexuality. You know, it comes first. um,
And
and
also, you can talk to kids about gender. You know, it's not you can't go into primary like or nurseries and talk about sexuality to 3-year-olds. That
Well,
wholly inappropriate. Jamie's going to tell me we do. But we can talk about gender and we can talk about, and maybe we should. But because of the way people are understanding gender, it means that messages are coming through to children before they have a chance to hear of, alternative explanation for why some people are non-conforming.
I have one more follow-up question. I'm gonna shut up. We uh, we've talked about, I know Sarah's mentioned this, James, we've all mentioned this, I believe, where it's kind of like we start to see this arc of like it looks like we're headed towards okay, no more transitioning autistic teens and people with all of these mental comorbidities. We'll just go back to like transing the kids that might be gay, because they're young and they've had gender dysphoria and they're same-sex attracted and so on and so forth. And I feel like that was kind of pitting this, Laura Edwards Leeper approach, more cautious approach against Joanna Olson Kennedy, the gender affirmative approach, and treating how whenever their gender dysphoria manifested, whether it was late onset or early or lifelong. Um, what do you think about that? Like, are you conflicted? Are you conflicted about that, just in terms of thinking about the future of this? Do you think that there's a safe way to continue this, or do you think that that idea that we're possibly trans and gay kids or proto gay kids it complicates it too much that we
Is
just can't
so
continue?
Okay, so firstly, if we're going to get it wrong, we're more likely to be getting it wrong with people who'd grow up to be gay. That is just simply a fact because of the cohort, right? And I think, well, why are we prepared to take risks with that cohort that we might not take with other cohorts? Because we all know it's been exceptionalized. And I wonder what's there. Subconsciously, I'm not suggesting anyone is, deliberately doing this, but we've done this, so we've got to question that. But then you have to go on to what is gay. So I spent some time working in adult sexual health and HIV services. And in those services, we don't always use gay when we're targeting men who have sex with men, because men who have sex with men may not identify as gay. So when we talk about gay, lesbian, bisexual, they can mean so many different things depending on the individual. So it can be a social identity that one takes on that one never acts on behaviorally, and maybe no one feels any kind of physiological attraction, but they still identify as gay, let's say. It can be you can have a physiological attraction to the same sex and absolutely not identify as gay or bisexual. And you can behaviorally be sleeping with the same sex and not identify as gay or bisexual. So what does this term mean? And when I talk to the young people, they don't identify as gay. So this story, because they haven't developed an identity, they haven't developed a gay or lesbian or bisexual identity. They might maybe queer sometimes. So it's very tricky because we need to respect and listen to that kid in the room with us. And one of my friends calls it gay and old money. So they may be same-sex attracted, but they may not be at all aligned with a lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or even queer identity because they identify as trans. And that is their truth. And they would see older gay people coming into this field to save them as like profoundly disrespectful, and like, you don't go for it, Corey.
Oh no, uh, I've had this conversation.
where the young people are finding that profoundly disrespectful?
No, where when you have been medicalized at a young age, the terms that older people use of gay and straight aren't as clear cut or meaningful.
Right.
And so when, we talked about this and with respect to LGBT Courage Coalition, is this younger cohort isn't going to understand, they're not going to be able to place themselves into LGB as clearly as you do, Jamie, or as you do, Ben, because they've been through this distorted experience.
Mm-hmm.
And
they won't see it as distortion.
Yeah, and for some of them, and like there's so many different trajectory, like all of our identities have been entirely unique in terms of development. But for some of them, they may have subconsciously been trying to escape an LGB experience or identity. So, and the last thing they want is to be pulled into that community. So, yeah, same-sex attraction is everywhere. It is clearly related to what is going on statistically, because you don't get 69 out of 70 people being same-sex attracted in the average cohort. But how we make sense of it and how we reach those young people to make meaning of that is, I think, still to play for. We're still working that out.
Okay, but you just said same-sex attraction is everywhere and in this cohort. Yeah. I don't think it was mentioned once in the New York Times protocol. Did they ever point out that 69 out of 70 were homosexual?
No, they had Annalie DeVries say that they had tried to screen for kids who they thought were transitioning because of like internalized homophobia. And then they don't say, but 69 out of the 70 of the kids that they picked were gay.
And we can't say they're gay, and they were not all exclusively same-sex attractive. A lot of those were also both attracted to both sexes, but only one was exclusively saying they were heterosexual.
I think it was 62 that were exclusively same-sex attracted, 7 that were bisexual, and then
Yeah, and the cohort's changed, hasn't it? That actually, as a percentage, the number of trans kids, trans identifying kids who are same-sex attractive has fallen, which suggests that maybe changes in the cohort mean that we're actually seeing a different group, or the group of young people expanding. I don't know, but so you definitely can't assume that a trans kid is same-sex attracted, but the odds are much higher than in other cohorts.
I think that that's where we err in terms of talking about, oh, this is just transing gay kids, or this is treating homosexuality, because it's not actually just it's actually treating gender nonconformity, or it's erasing gender nonconformity. It's erasing gender incongruence. It's saying that gender incongruence is a medical defect that needs to be corrected with medical procedures that lead to sterilization and lack of sexual function. That, I think, is the root of the problem, because for me, I can't tell people that, let's say, take a trans route and say, oh, why do you get to say you're so much happier than me, or so much more well-adjusted, or that you had the right path as growing up as this profoundly gender nonconforming kid who, by all intents and purposes, did struggle with gender dysphoria, was tormented, your sex was confused, people called you a girl, and you adapted and you masculinized as a coping technique because transing wasn't an option. I didn't know that was even a route to take. This was in the late 80s and 90s, early 90s. So yes, I'm not saying that I want that. I just wanted to be able to just be myself and express myself and not have to necessarily conform so rigidly. Now, I know that part of my masculinization had to do with progressing through puberty and testosterone and so on, and just social life and experiences, but a lot of it was motivated by fear. And a lot of it was motivated by threats of bullying and also violence. So, separating that is impossible. But that's where the conflict is. And so I think we are kind of hurting ourselves, or we're misspeaking when we say medicalizing homosexuality. Not that can't not be a part of it, but that we're really talking about gender nonconformity.
Yeah, and
isn't gender nonconformity more prevalent and found in those who are homosexuals?
yes,
Right.
Yeah, so it's almost like
overlapping circles, aren't they? Yeah.
So it's like we're yes, so if we're medicalizing gender nonconformity, we're trying to eradicate it. Who is the group of people that's going to suffer, that's going to be, collateral damage in this? Well, probably people that end up identifying as gay or lesbian or being same-sex attracted or exclusively same-sex attracted, because most gender nonconforming people are that way.
Yeah, if we're like, as I said, if we're taking risks with these young people, the group who we're taking risks with at the moment are more likely to be same-sex attracted, more likely to be neurodiverse, and more likely to have had incredibly complex lives, and it just feels so worrying that of all the kids that you take risks with this cohort of kids.
The most
But you can
vulnerable.
also see, yeah, really vulnerable. But you can also see, and what really complicates it then in terms of autonomy, what you were saying, Ben, like most young people just want to fit in and not, especially in adolescence, like there's a neuropsychological underpinning to the desire to connect with peers and belong in adolescence. It's innate, it's mammalian, it's a profoundly human desire. And some of the young people I work with are so gender non-conforming, and in every context that they walk into, people double take or they check their name badge. And these might be very gentle, lovely people, and they are experiencing the world finding them really difficult and complicated and hard to understand. And that hurts, and it really hurts adolescents. And how do you get away from that pain? We all have limited options, don't we? But we all have options to manage. How it's that idea of masking that we usually use in relation to neurodiversity. We all mask. I've got a colleague who always says, we all mask. I'm masking right now. But it's true, right? And we need to mask because we all have vulnerabilities that we don't want to share, and we all need to fit in enough, So how do really gender non-conforming kids, like how do they mask? How are they going to find a way to fit in?
Well, what's interesting is that, I was looking at the SOC 7 for WPAS Standards of Care 7, and in Standards of Care 7, it says there's a section that says the difference between gender nonconformity and gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Bye, Corey. Happy birthday. The difference between gender nonconformity and gender dysphoria, and there's a whole kind of explainer about it. Then within years, it's TGNC. Transgender, gender nonconforming. Umbrella.
Yeah. And gender diverse now, isn't it? It's gender diverse.
And gender diverse. And so it's been swallowed into the same thing. And I talk to people that kind of get confused about how adamant or passionate I am about this topic and how much I, let's say, oppose the medicalization of young people, because I just think that it is not, for so many reasons that we talk about consistently. And they say, but what if it's not just about medicalization? It's just about someone being who they are. And I'm like, okay, yes, I am literally only talking about medicalization. If there was, we are talking about labels, gay and lesbian. If there was this idea where people were saying like, oh, if the label instead had been trans, or had been like it was in the early 20th century, gender invert, fairy,
Yeah.
Faggot,
Yeah.
I mean, dyke, bull dyke. If this, there was different language for this, I'm not worried about the language. I'm worried about where the language leads, and where, this culture of this child identifies as trans. Now we have to scare the shit out of this child and say, you are approaching puberty and it is going to crush you. I can't ever remember saying the word puberty when I was an adolescent, when I was young. I knew that I remember learning about it in health class. I knew that it was something I was going to go through. Puberty was not a conversation. It was not young kids weren't saying puberty's so tough. Oh, I'm having a hard time with puberty. I mean, we just lived and grew, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean,
but it's not just the language. It's that the interventions themselves, to me, if we were talking about an intervention that's risk profile was so different.
mm-hmm.
like say the risk profile of the intervention was not infertility, sterility, harm to an endocrine system, if your risk profile was more along the lines of placebo effect, like I think we would be still having a different conversation. The problem is, and I think part of the problem that Sarah talks about that the protocol misses is that the risk profile is so it's serious and real.
Right. And I think like so in therapy, like all of us, when I teach, because I teach quite a lot on adolescent development and identity development, and I use an example of like my profession as psychologist. I identify as a psychologist, right? Now, 200, 300, like I know it's not the same, but run with me. And like 200, 300 years ago, there wasn't even a term psychologist. But I've gone through this process where I studied it and people saw me as a psychology student and then I got qualified and then they saw me as a psychologist and they paid me, and there's been this interaction between my interests and society, and I've now developed this quite concrete, quite crystallized long-term identity as a psychologist, right? So we all construct our identities in relationship with our societies, yeah? And like young people have a right to be able to construct whatever identity they want, trans, gay, bi, none of the above, all of the above. But you're absolutely right. Where the
your identity as a psychologist development didn't lead to your
Right. Okay. So that is where the ethical. So in therapy, we are used to these constructivist ideas, to these kind of these ideas of you could see it like this, you could see it like that, and children should be free to play and explore and try it all on. But that's why we always start talking about the medical pathway, because then that, in a sense, it can potentially truncate a developmental pathway. And even if, they benefit or it works, however you measure that, at what price? That's what we come back to. Because, the protocol didn't talk about the benefit stroke risk profile in a very fair way. Or maybe, yeah. Did it at all, Jamie? I didn't hear some of the earlier episodes.
Sarah, did you hear any real conversation around the medical risks and harms?
No, really not. And even when it came up organically, like we talked about this with the FG, talking about not being able to pee after undergoing a genital surgery, major complication, like they just move on. So no, there was no serious discussion of
and fertility.
It also came up a little bit with mental, the fertility question and mental scene, like, so I don't know, I'm 16. And then the podcast takes it, as seriously as he took it at 16.
Yeah. Anna, we didn't give you a pre-warning about how we wrap up.
How do you wrap up? Is there some ritual that I should be aware of?
Yeah, we didn't. I'm so sorry we didn't tell you about the ritual. And it does not involve cats climbing on you. That's not the ritual.
Yeah.
My cats are, outside. Maybe I should let them in.
No, the ritual is that we like to share with our listeners something this week that struck you or you enjoyed that has nothing to do with gender at all.
Mm-hmm.
We try
to. Or we all going to be part.
We all do it. So, I mean, I can go first, or Ben or Sarah, who's ready?
You go for it, Jamie.
Okay. So I travel way too much and I find myself stuck in airports, and I always go look in the bookstores at the airports and I never buy anything because I'm never really inclined. But I finally found a book in New Hampshire's airport. So I've been reading The Wide, Wide Sea by Hampton Sides. Imperial Ambition, First Contact, and the Fateful Final Journey of Captain James Cook. And I absolutely love books about the people on ships getting stuck in the Arctic and like cannibalism. So this one is
quite niche.
Right, they haven't made it to the Arctic yet, but they're headed that way. They're
really hopeful.
They're in Tahiti right now. But I love Arctic traveling.
Okay, well, we have a clinical psychologist here. We could unpack the cannibalism thing.
I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm not a
Okay.
psychoanalyst, so I'm not going to see anything there anyway.
Oh, no, but I've been really enjoying this book. I've been reading it every night before bed. And also, we've been rewatching The Handmaid's Tale.
Brave.
Yeah.
What about
Okay.
you, Sarah? What do you got?
My recommendation is, I don't think I've ever purchased something that I saw on a billboard, but I'd never seen a billboard that said chill out and eat a pickle before. And so there are these in the US, there are these Grillo's dill pickles, and they are so amazing. And big fan, absolutely ecstatic
Is
now.
it like a whole dill pickle?
They're like spears. Oh, they're great.
I love a good pickle.
I am gonna just say that close friends getting married. I'm going to a wedding tomorrow, one of my closest friends, and there's a big thing tonight down in the village, and so I'm excited to celebrate with her. I'm also going to say really quickly that I know some audience members might be like, you guys didn't talk about the LA Children's Hospital thing enough. We didn't talk about Joanne Olson Kennedy. I mean, we did touch on it a little bit. We talked about the difference between the US and the UK, but that was a big development. Maybe we'll talk about it more the next podcast. There really isn't so much to unpack yet in terms of, what the staff is dealing with. It is due to threats against pooling funding, eligibility for Medicaid, Medi-Cal, and also threats of prosecuting gender affirming care providers. What is it, Jamie?
Well, I was just going to say, maybe listeners also, I'm so interested to know, is Joanna going to keep in this field? Do we know if she's hired somewhere else, if she's looking? I would also love to know where the hell Scott Leibowitz has gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what her response is and if she has statements about this and anything like that. All right. And Dr. Hutchinson, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any non-gender? Do you have any non-gender recommendations or anything this week?
I've had a mixed week. I've had quite a few little joyful moments. It's hot, it's sunny in London, so I got to sit in my garden, which was really nice. One of my children got an award in their kickboxing class for being awesome, and his delight was delightful to watch. And being a total geek, there's a new Jane Austen documentary out. Which I watched with my partner, and then we're planning to go to the Jane Austen Museum in Bath on the summer. So, great things, very exciting rock and roll things to look forward to.
Love it. That's great.
What is the title of this Jane Austen documentary?
Oh, I can't remember. It's on iPlayer. Jane Austen. I can't remember.
Okay. Okay.
I'll share it in the link.
Well, thank you again. This was fantastic. I hope you come back and join us sometime and chat more with us, because it was.
Ben, and it's lovely to speak to people who are so informed and who care so much about the field. So thank you.
Thanks,
All
Sarah.
right. Everyone have a great week. Bye.